I'm Gary Burgess, and welcome to Holding Court, the Jersey Law Podcast. Joining me, my friend and expert, family law guru, and partner at Vibert's, Advocate Rose Colley. Rose, it's great to see you again.
Thank you, Gary.
And today, an unusual phrase that I hadn't come across until recently, silver splitters. I've heard of silver surfers, of older people getting online. I'm guessing silver surfers is an interesting trend we've seen in recent times of particularly over 50s divorcing more frequently than previously.
Yes, I mean, it used to be the case when I was first in practice that very few people over 50 divorced. But certainly in recent years, it's become quite a trend. You're right. Usually people over 50, sometimes people much older, sometimes people slightly younger. But yeah, we tend to use silver splitters as the phrase, the buzz phrase, I guess.
And what are the triggers for this? Is there any common ground? Is this to do with lifestyle or life events? What is it that's causing older couples to decide, you know what, it's game over?
I think there are probably three things. It's a growing number of women in particular, I think, realise that they can be independent financially, and there's this awareness that they've got the rest of their lives still and they're actually quite bored in the relationship. Then there are those couples where they may well have stayed together whilst the children were at school, at university very often, but actually they don't like each other very much again. So they decide, yes, now's the time to go our separate ways. And I guess there's the third category, and there is a little bit of a trend for this where I'm not quite sure the golden surfers online or the silver surfers online where they meet someone else online.
That's really interesting. Just opportunities that may not have existed 10, 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
And suddenly someone is there thinking there may be a brighter future and it may not be with my husband or wife.
Yeah, because I'm bored and yeah, we've just fallen out of love.
It feels to me there's a real sadness about that, but your job is not to feel sadness. It's to be that pragmatic, objective person in the room when these proceedings begin. What happens? Is this people coming to you saying separation is the way forward, or is it, you know what, we just want to crack on and get divorced, it's game over?
I think with older people it is very often I've made the decision, I want to move on, I want to move out of the marriage, and I want everything sorted out as easily as it can be and as fairly as it can be.
And is it easier compared to a younger couple wanting to go through this process? Are the finances more straightforward to sort out? Or actually, could you argue it the other way, that there's these pension pots reaching maturity and actually maybe there's more money at stake?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is yes and no. I think it is easier because particularly capital pots tend to be bigger. It's easier because usually the children have left home, so you don't have all the complications around finances for children. But on the other hand, it can be more complicated because, as you rightly say, things like pensions start to play. But also, even nowadays, there are large numbers of usually, not always, but usually wives who have been out of the workplace maybe 20, 30 years and are never going to go back into the workplace now. So you have this hugely difficult area of what's called spousal maintenance, or maintenance that you pay to the other party.
And is that where you are effectively working out what that other party's notional income would be if they were working, because they suddenly find themselves in the situation where they may have to?
The answer is no. It is in many cases all to do with what will meet their their needs
Right.
based on a life expectancy table.
That's the other interesting aspect of this then. So you are working through effectively how long do we think this person will continue to exist?
Yeah, I mean, there's this book called At a Glance that is released every year, and it has a life expectancy table in it. Obviously, assuming that someone is in average health. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the numbers vary, but it will be based on if your needs are 25,000 a year, if that was going to be capital that I have to give to you, let's say either until my retirement or even the rest of your natural life, what is that amount going to be? And they tend to be pretty eye-watering sums.
And is the agreement based on a lump sum or is the agreement based on a drip through your lifetime?
It can be a combination, and that's where I think couples within this area, in terms of splitting, divorcing, do t- do need to think things through very carefully, because you may have a relatively large capital pot, but it's still got to house both of them. And often retirement is very near, so there may well be retirement income, but it's still quite unusual to find both husband and wife have similar retirement incomes. So some of the husband's income may well need to be passed to the wife, unless she can be given more capital, some of which she uses for housing, but the rest is assumed will be invested very often in another property and she'll live on the rent.
You mentioned spousal maintenance, but there are
Mm.
three different kinds of maintenance that could be arrived at, as I understand
There
it.
are, I think, two answers to that question. There are three what are called types of cases.
Okay.
There's probably, I'd say, 70% of cases are what are called needs cases. And that's where you need to split the assets to meet the needs, let's say, of older people in terms of housing and income, for example. Then there are what are called compensation cases that are very, very rare. And a compensation case probably wouldn't be so important with this sort of age group. Compensation cases tend to be very often women, let's say in their mid to late 40s, where they've given up a very lucrative career in order for there to be a joint decision that she brings up the children, husband continues working, continue continues to increase his income. But there aren't very many of those. And then there are what are called sharing cases. Now, sharing cases are where you have a big capital pot because you don't share income, but you share capital. That's again an important distinction. So in sharing cases, you may end up 50-50, so actually sharing, but there's more opportunity to what's called ring fence certain assets. So let's say, for example, before we got married, um, you built up one of your pensions, so it's premarital. Or let's say I inherited a castle from my father before we got married. So there's more opportunity to take those out and to ring fence them. Whereas in needs cases, they all go into the pot, regardless of where they came from.
Goodness, it does get so
It
complicated.
does get complicated.
And I can see, whereas as much as perhaps your instinct is to resolve this quickly and speedily and informally, actually to have that lawyer to guide you through the process and sometimes, I guess, pull you back from the precipice and say, perhaps playing fairer may
Yeah.
be wiser.
Yeah,
Having that there is
absolutely.
incredibly useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other answer to the question that you raised a few moments ago, where you said there are different types of spousal maintenance, and the answer is there is, and it's particularly important for older people getting divorced. The courts prefer what's called a clean break. Now, a clean break is where no maintenance passes hands. or if it does pass hands, it's only for a fairly limited period of time. But obviously, the older people get and the longer they've been outside the job market, or they might be already retired, as the sort of couples we're talking about, clean breaks probably are not going to happen. So you probably do need to pay spousal maintenance. And then the issue is, depending on very often age and other assets, do I just pay you maintenance for a few years? Or do I pay you what's called joint lives maintenance, which is until the end of your life or my life?
It feels so complicated. It also feels there's a slightly different imperative if an older couple are getting divorced, that there's quite an incentive to not have this drag on
Mm.
because time is really precious.
Time is really precious, obviously, depending on their age, but I guess for all of us, time's really precious. But um, these cases can sometimes drag on because there tend to be more complicated arguments. We briefly touched earlier, I think, on the question of pensions. Pensions can be hugely complicating assets, partly because, unlike in England, where you can split and share them, in Jersey, there's no law allowing you to do that. So you can only offset.
Okay.
And that can have quite unfair implications. So if, let's say, you're 50, you can't take anything out of your pension until, let's say, you're 55, sometimes 57. But that capital estimated value of your pension is, let's say, 1.1 million. None of that is liquid. So you may have to give, let's say, the other spouse the house, for example, which may be worth 1.1 million. So that spouse gets the house and can move on, but you're left with this illiquid pension pot, which you can't touch for another few years. Now, most cases are not that simple, but I think that shows that pensions where you can't just, as I said, you can in England, share it. So you share the house and then you share the pension, and the trustees of the pension scheme have to split it. You can't do that here.
So that can feel mightily unfair because actually you're awarding me future benefits when I can access that pension, but I may have to give away something to my spouse in the meantime, just so we can get this break done
Yeah.
and dusted.
And that happens at all ages, but pensions tend to be particularly important the nearer people get to pensionable age, because very often, obviously not everyone, but very often people, particularly in the finance industry here, have built up large pension pots.
What role does health play in all of this? It might be that people's health is changing, is failing. There are
Mhm.
limitations on their life. Is that even a factor
No, it
in
is
this
a factor.
process?
Jersey follows, again, English case law. And in England, there are things called the Section 25 factors, which have been around certainly since I qualified a long time ago. And one of these Section 25 factors is the health of the parties, the age, length of marriage, but also the health of the parties. So clearly that will then link to someone's needs. So if someone is in ill health, on the one hand, they may well have needs now for medical care, but maybe for a particular type of accommodation, or obviously someone to look after them. But on the other hand, because of their health, it's also a factor they're not going to get spousal maintenance probably for a long period of time, because the assumption is they're not going to be with us for a very long period of time. So health is absolutely a factor.
And I imagine that can lead to some very difficult conversations where I mentioned earlier about your need to be pragmatic in this
Yeah.
conversation, but actually the couple perhaps need to stop, draw breath, and go, we do need to be actually brutally honest about this stuff.
Yeah, I think they do. I think most people are. But again, I think there sometimes is this tendency that one party might think, yes, he or she isn't in the best of health, but they're over exaggerating it. Um, or there may be a genuine recognition that, yes, their needs are greater because of their health. So it does all link into health, but as I say, also links into the length of the marriage as well, because obviously not everyone in their 50s, remember, will have been married for 20 years. Very often, these are the couples who are coming up to maybe their second divorce. And of course, they may well have moved a lot of their capital and income during the first divorce. They might even still, in a very few cases, be paying spousal maintenance to their first wife, for example, who hasn't got remarried. And that all, I think, leads to something I would absolutely say: if you're embarking on a second marriage, then you really, really need to carefully think about what's called a prenup.
I was wondering about
Yeah.
that, and I've always wondered about how legitimate a prenup is. Is that a real thing? Is it enforceable?
It is
Is
a
it
real
advisable?
thing. It is advisable in certain cases. They're not absolutely binding on the court because the court has discretion, as we've talked about earlier. But a prenup, particularly for second marriages, where you want to protect what you've built up previously, very often for children, can be really important. So it's more likely that the prenup is going to be recognised by the courts when the children are not young. And of course, in the sort of age group that we're talking about, there are very unlikely to be any more children or any children born to that marriage.
And it feels a very unromantic thing to do.
Mm,
There you are in the throes of love and thinking about this new relationship and thinking about marriage, and you're not even considering divorce on the
no.
horizon because this is going to last forever. And then we talk prenups? Really?
Yeah, and in fact, in reality, it's often the children of the older husband or wife to be who will say, Mum or Dad, this is our inheritance. You need to protect it because, of course, we want you to be really happy, but you need to build up your own assets and happiness together. So the motivator is often the older children,
That's really interesting.
which isn't romantic at all,
But
but it can be sensible.
absolutely, and that is the point, isn't it? It's going in with your eyes wide open, planning for the worst, whilst of course hoping for the best. Do you see? We spoke at the start of this trend that over 50s getting divorced is increasing. Do you also see any trends around how that divorce process goes, whether it's more pragmatic, whether it's more friendly, or indeed the opposite? Have you observed any
Um,
particular themes when it comes to silver splitters?
I think it's not necessarily more acrimonious. I think people often don't recognize how complicated it can be to unravel things that may have been built up over 20 or 30 years of marriage, and things that may have happened in the meantime, whereby husband or wife are saying, I should be able to keep that, as we were saying earlier. So I'm not sure they're more acrimonious. They're definitely more complicated. And I think sometimes there is this tendency, perhaps for older people, without generalizing, to be slightly more stubborn and more change resistant, maybe.
Well, on that basis, I'm going to wrap up by asking you for your three top tips. If we have silver splitters or potential silver splitters hanging on your every word, what's your three nuggets of wisdom that will help them through this process?
I think the first thing is to recognize it has been usually a long relationship, and therefore you can't very often just hang on to something and say, that was mine. Particularly, that's my pension. That's very common. And he or she, usually she, will not touch it. So I think that's the first thing. Be realistic. Secondly, I think try and recognize that you both need to move forward. So again, to try and come to a settlement that is one that will enable you both to move on. So there's no resentment, because very often there are adult children and grandchildren, and obviously they don't want to be affected by all of this. And I think my third tip is that if you're thinking then of embarking on a second, few people even the third marriage, then do think very carefully about the prenup, because that can be really, really useful if things were to go wrong.
Always good advice.
Thank you.
Always well explained. Advocate Rose Colley, partner and family law expert at Vibers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Gary.
And we'll catch you next time for more Holding Court, the Jersey Law Podcast.